So now let's take a look at my very favorite genre of all, modern fantasy. Anybody know what this book is? This is Percy Jackson. And even though it's the movie version of Percy Jackson, this is still one of my favorite modern fantasy tales. But what makes modern fantasy modern fantasy? Well, as with traditional fantasy, modern fantasy is distinguished from other genres by story elements that violate the natural physical laws of our known world. Events that are akin to magic, sorcerers, witches, genies, hobbits, dwarves, giants, magical worlds, talking animals. These things that seem miraculous as we're reading the books are what categorize a tale as a modern fantasy. But fantasy stories don't just employ these fantastic elements casually. In fact, modern fantasy is probably the most difficult genre to write, because an author has to create a new set of physical laws and then conform unerringly to them. And a lot of these modern fantasy tales become series, or most of them are written as series, trilogies, those kind of things. And they become the fuel for fan fiction. Fan fiction are, the people who are just so immersed in these stories that, you'll go to a Comic-Con or something like that, or a movie of these that is made from these books, based on these books, and that's the people that are dressed up as the characters and who get so involved in the story that they look to find the errors a lot of times as they go through. I know I was on a Harry Potter site one time, and they were talking about how something was said in the Goblet of Fire, and the way it was presented later in Half-Blood Prince kind of conflicted with each other. Okay? So an author of a fantasy novel has to be very careful that their world meshes all the way through the story, especially since, as I said earlier, these modern fantasy tales, tend to be multiple volumes. Okay? 3 is usually the magic number, the trilogy, but some have, up to 7 books, such as the Harry Potter series, before this whole story finally ties itself together and comes to an end. So what are the categories of modern fantasy? So this is where we see how broad a genre modern fantasy is, because of the broadness of the magical elements. The first one is animal fantasy. And when we think of animal fantasies, we can talk about Charlotte's Web. You think, Charlotte's Web's a fantasy novel? It is, because who talks in the story? Ah, yes. The pig talks, spider talks, all the animals talk. So that's an animal fantasy. Another is The Wind in the Willows. That's an animal fantasy, because the animals talk. Animals aren't supposed to talk in real life, so whenever you have a book where the animals actually talk, it would be considered a fantasy novel. Okay? Toys and objects are imbued with life. The Journey of Edward Tulane is a beautiful fantasy novel that falls into this category, where Edward Tulane the rabbit is looking for love. I'll just say it that way. Okay. Pinocchio is another one. Then the ones that have maybe tiny humans. Anybody heard of the Borrowers series? Okay, that would be considered a fantasy novel, fantasy book. There might be peculiar characters and situations, such as in Mary Poppins. You're thinking again, Mary Poppins is a fantasy? Yes, because how many nannies fly? How many nannies can pull a coat rack out of their carpet bag? Alright, so Mary Poppins would be a fantasy novel. Another would be The Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman, which is pretty much a modern retelling of The Jungle Book by Rudyard Kipling, set in, only the Graveyard Book is set in a graveyard, obviously. All right, so it's a good book. I recommend it. There might also be imaginary worlds, like Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. My apologies for the interruption. My doorbell rang. Alright, so we're talking about peculiar characters and situations. Now we're on to imaginary worlds. Alice in Wonderland has imaginary worlds. Good heavens. Most of them that we think about have imaginary worlds. Okay? Then there are magical powers. Things that people can do that they shouldn't be able to do. And one that is mentioned in this book I'm reading is The Chocolate Touch. That would be a book that would fall under the magical powers category. And there are supernatural tales. Two of them mentioned here are Wait Till Helen Comes, a ghost story by Mary Downing Hahn, and The Seer of Shadows by Avi. A-V-I is that author's name. Okay. Then there are time warp fantasies. And then my favorite are high fantasies, which would be like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, Percy Jackson. Those are all would be high fantasy. And then when we take traditional tales and novelize them, they become modern fantasy. And one that they talk about here, and this is one that I haven't read, is called Beauty by Robin McKinley. So these are books that have elements of some kind of a magic or something that we just know can't happen in the real world. Or, I mean, it could, but we'd have to have some kind of a technology to make it happen. And that's, we'll talk about in just a minute about science fiction. That's where science fiction rolls in here. Okay? So if these are the categories of modern fantasy, well then, what are the themes or the motifs that make a fantasy a fantasy? Okay. So let's look at those. And the first one is magic. And that is modern fantasy's most basic element. Some kind of magic. Something we can't explain any other way. And each of the other motifs here are touched by magic. Okay? So our second motif is other worlds or secondary worlds. Okay. So in much of fantasy there's some kind of special geography or universe. Sometimes these worlds are in fairy tales, simply long, long ago, and sometimes they look like the world we live in, but we know that they're not. And sometimes there are totally maybe different planets or places that function with a totally different set of rules than what we have. Okay? The first kind of otherworldly methods or setting is setting the tale just someplace imaginary. And Middle Earth, as in the Lord of the Rings, would be just someplace totally imaginary. That second method takes the characters from our world and puts them in another world through some kind of a portal, like Dorothy going to Oz, or Alice going to Wonderland. Okay? Wendy getting to go to Neverland with Peter Pan. Okay? So they're in our world, but they go to another world by some magical means. Okay? And then the third takes that secondary world and invades our primary world. And this is where we think of Harry Potter. Harry Potter is set in our normal, everyday world, but it's kind of there on the fringes as part of our world. It's there, but we don't know it's there. All right? Then the third motif here is good versus evil. Every single fantasy has the element of good versus evil, both traditional and folklore fantasy and modern fantasy. The theme of good versus evil always shows up. Okay? Then there's heroism, however you want to say the word. Okay? There's some kind of a hero, and there's some cycle that hero goes through to complete their quest. Okay? So, starts being called to some kind of adventure. Okay? Then he goes into the other world or a place that's no longer safe and secure. So he answers that call to adventure. Okay? Then he has to survive trials of some kind in his new environment. Then that hero is also assisted usually by some kind of a protective figure. You have friends, or there might be a witch, like in Wizard of Oz, who comes to help Dorothy. Gandalf comes to help in The Hobbit and also in The Lord of the Rings. Aslan is there in the Chronicles of Narnia. Okay? So some kind of a protective figure that helps the hero. Okay? Then the hero matures. We watch the hero grow up, and I think of Harry Potter. And we start when he's 11, and we watch him grow up and mature into this 18-year-old hero that saves the day in the end. Okay? Then the hero returns home, and usually that's where the story ends. It's come full circle. Right? He's at home. He gets some kind of a announcement that says, hey, there's an adventure waiting to happen. He joins in the adventure. He goes through all those elements of the adventure, and he finally returns home. And I think of Bilbo Baggins in The Hobbit. You know, he's there. Gandalf shows up. Then all of a sudden all these dwarfs show up and tell him that, you know, they need him to be a burglar. And he doesn't want to, but finally he decides to. And he goes through all these different elements that we talked about. And at the end, he comes home. And that's where the story comes to an end. And our fifth motif that shows up in fantasy, we see that there's always some kind of special character types. They can come from our legendary past or from an author's imagination, and rarely are these people humans. And fairies, pixies, giants, wicked witches, good witches, ogres, vampires, wizards, dwarves, elves, all sorts of different characters that show up in fantasies. And then finally, we have fantastic objects. There's some kind of a prop. Harry Potter has his wand. Dorothy had her ruby slippers. Bilbo had his ring. There was the witch's wand, and even the, excuse me, I'm going to apologize because I'm going to show my ignorance that Dorothy has silver slippers when you read the novel. Dorothy has ruby slippers when you watch the movie. Ha-ha! There's a little piece of trivia maybe you didn't know. So, there's some kind of fantastic object that usually goes along with the story. Now, some books have all 6 of these motifs, and if they involve all 6 of these, then they're considered high fantasy. And those are those stories like The Wizard of Oz, Harry Potter, Percy Jackson, those stories that incorporate all 6 of these. Some of them, however, only might use 1. And like The Wind in the Willows and Charlotte's Web, what makes them fantasy is those talking animals, which is the magic part. But they're still considered fantasy stories. So, this is the basic elements of what makes a fantasy fantasy. And the key here is magic. But there's one type of fantasy that follows a lot of these motifs, except that the magic can usually be explained by technology. And that's science fiction. science fiction has the heroes, they have the special characters, they have the objects, they have the other worlds, there's good versus evil, there's the hero cycle. But in most of what we consider science fiction, we can explain the magic part through some kind of technology. The War of the Worlds, time machine. They go back and forth in time because of the time machine. The Hunger Games, it's the that's Divergent. Divergent, the simulations, that kind of magic piece. In the Hunger Games, it's all of the fantastical things that the game makers can do while they're in the arena, that makes it kind of magical. But we can explain that magic through technology. So fantasy is, like I said, my favorite genre. And it's my favorite genre because I like I like getting lost in the story, escaping to a different place and a different world, of reading about good versus evil in a way that's maybe not as close to home as a contemporary realistic fiction book might have. Modern fantasy is a way to say, oh, I can see the consequences of poor choices and actions through these magical creatures and adventures and the wars and all that stuff, and understand in the end that those bad choices are what led to all the bad stuff. Okay? But also, usually in the end of a modern fantasy story, good triumphs. And so we've got that, as this quote here says, fantasy-based stories give readers hope. Hope to keep living and hope to keep on reading. So pick up a modern fantasy book and just enjoy it.